Well, hello, everybody. I'm Michael Kimmich. I'm a professor of history at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And it's my great pleasure today. I won't say this morning because of where our audience may be coming from, different places, but it's my great pleasure today to introduce for the third lecture in the series on the history of modern Ukraine, Professor Serhii Plokhii. I'll give only the briefest of introductions so that we can get right to the lecture, but Professor Plokhii is Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University and also Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, to be sure, one of the world's leading scholars of Ukrainian, Central European, Russian and Soviet history. And once again, it's our great pleasure to have him for this, the third lecture, and alas, the final lecture in the series on the history of modern Ukraine. So with that, Professor Plokhii, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thanks again, Michael, for this introduction and for the invitation. And for those who attended my previous lectures and discussions, welcome back. The title of today's meeting and lecture / discussion is the fall of the USSR, the fall of the Soviet Union. That is the general frame with, of course, I will be focusing very much on Ukraine and on the relations between Russia and Ukraine in the last decade, mostly last decade of the existence of the Soviet Union. Now, generally, my take on the current war, the Russian aggression against Ukraine that started in 2014 and turned into the all-out war in February of this year, is that we are dealing not with something absolutely new as a phenomenon, historical phenomenon, that we are dealing with the story of the disintegration of the Russian Empire, which then became the Soviet Union. So in many ways, this is a continuation of the story that started in the late 1980s and early 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union. So I will not go into the developments really after 1991 or 1992 in my lecture and presentation, but I certainly welcome questions if you have any questions regarding the post-1991, post-1992 developments, including the current war, and the sort of the questions that I think I can entertain and answer would be certainly informed by the historical perspective and by the history of Ukraine, Russian Empire, and the history of the Soviet Union. So again, I will focus mostly on the last decade or two of the existence of the Soviet Union, but questions if you think that there is something to gain in understanding today's war by looking at that from the perspective of history, certainly raise these issues, raise these questions. I will be more than happy to answer them, or maybe to engage you in the discussion in some other way. Now, I will do what I did with my previous presentations. I will share with you my PowerPoints, which are really, in this particular case, will be images. I don't think there will be much maps, mostly images, and they will help structure the lecture, structure the discussion. So we stopped last week. It was on Friday with the discussion of the World War II, the impact of the World War II on Ukraine, on the Soviet Union, and the transfer of the Crimea from the Russian Federation to Ukraine, to the jurisdiction of Ukraine, as part of the celebration of the 300-year anniversary of the quote-unquote reunification of Ukraine and Russia. And I mentioned at that time that the reasons for which Crimea was transferred were of economic and administrative nature, but the justification that was provided was very much of a historical one, And it also reflected a particular period, the rhetoric that was used, a particular period in the return of the Russian imperial narrative to the center of the Soviet historical thinking. So the term reunification itself was coming certainly from the 19th century and dealt with this broader understanding of Russian history as history of the nation allegedly formed during the Kievan Rus times, a big Russian nation, and reunification of Ukraine and Russia was, in that sense, reunification of a big Russian nation. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about in that context of the celebration of reunification was that was also an ideological campaign that launched a very interesting relationship, not so much between Russia and Ukraine per se, but certainly between the Russian and Ukrainian elites, because the idea of reunification was put forward by Nikita Khrushchev, who comes to power in Moscow after Stalin's death in the 1950s, was able to push aside his numerous competitors. And one of the ways how he did that was that he mobilized, he had actually more loyal supporters and clients in the party system, in the party machine, than any of his competitors. The trick was that the way how the Soviet Union was structured was that the Russian Federation didn't have a communist party of its own, while the largest communist party as a separate entity within the Soviet Union was the Communist Party of Ukraine. It didn't mean much, but also it meant, in a sense, when it comes to the building this clientele networks, that was an important platform. And the communist cadres from Ukraine constituted the largest voting bloc in the Central Committee. And of course, the Central Committee, not the Politburo, was the institution that was formally responsible for the election or dismissal of the state leaders and party leaders at the same time. So certainly that happened with Khrushchev. Khrushchev in 1957 was saved against the coup launched against him by the members of the Presidium or later Politburo by the vote in the Central Committee. But then it was the very same Central Committee that removed Khrushchev from power. His successor, who launched coup now against Khrushchev, was also the product of the Ukrainian Communist Party machine. Leonid Brezhnev was again supported now by the same Central Committee, and this rule of Brezhnev became known also as a rule of Dnipropetrovsk mafia. So it wasn't just the cadres from Ukraine, but there were also cadres from Brezhnev's native region of Dnipropetrovsk in Ukraine that really established a hold on some key elements of power in Moscow. And that story continued again since mid-1950s all the way into the mid-1980s. So 30 years when we see the former leaders coming from Ukraine, backed by the Ukrainian party elite, holding power in the Soviet Union. Most of the Cold War, really, it's on the Soviet side. We see that particular arrangement. It was in the early 50s, early 60s that a book by Yaroslav Belinsky was published, The Second Soviet Republic, about Ukraine. So again, there was special status of Ukraine was already reflected in the title of the book. Ukrainian party elite formally was in charge of many institutions in the Soviet Union. In reality, it emerged as I would say, partner of the Russian elite, a party elite, in running the empire, in running the Soviet Union. The unwritten rule after Stalin's death was that the leader of the Republican Party organization has to be a representative of the local nationality, let's say Kazakh in Kazakhstan or Tajik in Tajikistan. But there was always a second secretary that was not local and was sent from the center. And as a rule, those second secretaries were ethnic Russians. But what you see in the 60s and 70s, they could be also very often ethnic Ukrainians. And Ukraine was the only republic probably where there was an exception from that rule, where the local was also the second secretary of the Communist Party. So that pointed to a special relationship of the Ukrainian party elites in that arrangement that emerges in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. Looking at the historical parallels, the closest parallel that comes, at least to my mind, is the situation in the Habsburg Empire once it becomes Austria-Hungary after defeats to Germany in 1867. Where it formally becomes a dual monarchy of the Austrian and Hungarian monarchy. You don't see the same kind of a formal arrangement in the Soviet Union, but really 60s, 70s, and good part of the 80s, the Soviet Union is a sort of a Russian-Ukrainian condominium, at least when you look at the role of the party elites and people coming from that region. Both Khrushchev and Brezhnev are ethnic Russians coming from Ukraine, which of course stressed the idea that the formal divisions really between Russians and Ukrainians don't count or shouldn't count for much. Brezhnev, through most of his career, was putting in his documents in the ethnicity box named Ukrainian. He was ethnic Russian, born in Ukraine, up until he moves to Moscow. Then he changes his formal identification from Ukrainian to Russian. So here you see not just the return of the idea of a big Russian nation in the rhetoric of the 300-year anniversary of the reunification of Russia and Ukraine, but also in the arrangement on the elite level, where the lines are not clear or very often not important at all. So it is a push on the upper level of really sort of a merging of Ukrainian and Russian elites as one, representing a big Russian nation. This is photographs of the members and candidate members of Politburo, of course, led by Brezhnev. Here is the future general secretary of the party, first Andropov and then Gorbachev. But let me point first at the people whom Brezhnev brought with him to power in Moscow, to illustrate just the points that I made. So one of the key figures in the Central Committee, Andrei Kirilenko, another product of the Ukrainian party machine, like like Brezhnev was the secretary of the Zaporizhia party organization in the past. A member, the Prime Minister Nikolai Tikhonov, who was the major figure in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in Ukraine, in Nikopol in particular. Chernenko is someone with the ethnic Russian with the Ukrainian last name, comes with Brezhnev from his service in Moldova, and is one of the key figures as well. The closest ally of Brezhnev and the leader of Ukraine in the 70s and good part of the 80s, Volodymyr Shcherbetsky, rumored to be one of the possible choices of Brezhnev himself to replace him in the 1980s. Who is not here are, of course, the Minister of Interior, another person with the Dnipropetrovsk background, or the two deputies of the head of the KGB. So again, that's just at the top. Why this collective portrait of the Politburo, of the leading group in the Soviet Union, is also important to look at the representatives of other nationalities. And what you see here, Kunaev, the head of the Kazakh Communist Party, and Shcherbitsky, the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, they are two full members of Politburo. So stressing the particular importance of Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is interesting also in a sense, not only in terms of the size of the country, the size of the population, but by the fact that Kazakhs themselves were the minority on the territory of Kazakhstan. The majority belonged to the Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and that allowed later Alexander Solzhenitsyn to imagine in 1990 the creation of a new Slavic state, East Slavic state, which would include not only Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but also northern Kazakhstan. Again, it's representation of the non-Russian republics, but also those non-Russian republics that are the largest and that are the most Russian in terms of the either representation of the ethnic Russians or the cultural Russification of the Soviet Union. Again, the leaders of Uzbekistan here, the leaders of Georgia. Where is our Azeri guy Aliyev? Somehow I can't find him here. Here he is. So there is that representation on the high level as well. A very different group of the leaders in comparison to the Politburo around Stalin, for example, where the republics and Republican leaders were actually much less represented. Khrushchev was the only exception. Other figures were the heads of the major ministries or people's commissariats. But looking at the Brezhnev's Politburo, you see here not only many non-Russians, but also many non-Russians representing particular republics. So you see this imperial character of the Soviet Union in a much more pronounced way, I would say, than that was during the times of Stalin. And you see when you look at the literature on the subject that there are two processes happening place at the same time. On the one hand, the Russification of the cultural life, of the educational system, institutions of higher learning, of the industry is certainly moving ahead. There is also a movement of the population related to the major industrial projects of the era and region. Especially this Russification is pronounced in the East Slavic republics of the Soviet Union, like Belarus, where there is almost no place left in the public sphere to Belarusian language, and of course Ukraine, where there is almost no place left for Ukrainian language in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. So this is one process. But on the other hand, you see that during the period, Brezhnev's period of so-called stagnation, there is all of these leaders in the republics, they build their own clienteles, and their power becomes actually much stronger and less dependent on the center, and more dependent on the support of these clients than it ever been during the Soviet rule, during the Soviet times. So culturally, there is centralization and Russification, but in terms of the structure of the power, the positions of the leaders of the republics, they become stronger, and they are much more represented in terms of the formal institutions of power, like Politburo, like the Central Committee, despite the fact that the key decisions are still made by those members of Politburo who are in Moscow. Now, what I was talking about before that was certainly the high echelon of power and what is happening there. What is happening on the lower level, or on the level of the it would be still politics, but the politics that are who are, let me formulate that in a different way. Who are the main challengers, the main threat to the regime? They're the dissidents. They're the dissidents in the Soviet Union in general. They are the same role is played by the dissidents in Ukraine. So if you look at the opposition or any opposition that the Politburo is concerned about, this is the dissident movement. They're deciding on the Politburo level what to do with Solzhenitsyn, what to do with Sakharov, the key decisions in terms of what to do with the members of the Helsinki groups that emerge in the Soviet Union. Again, this are among the key concerns of the KGB at that time and key concerns of Politburo. A major change happens in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s with the rise of the Helsinki groups and Helsinki movement in general. It is not there by design, in the sense that the human rights obligations that the Soviet Union takes on itself while signing the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, they were not viewed by the Western powers as something that was supposed to undermine the strength of the communist regime in any way. It is the dissident movement that already exists in the Soviet Union that sees an opportunity with the Soviet Union signing the Helsinki Accords, opportunity for them to really rethink the role of the dissident movement, organize itself in a different way, and acquire sort of legitimacy, international legitimacy in particular, that didn't exist before. The dissidents, before they become human rights activists, they come from different walks, or so to say, ideological walks of life. Most of them in Russia, in Ukraine, and other republics are the people who really were start in the late 50s and early 60s, believing in the potential of the regime to reform itself as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, but eventually get disappointed in it and move in different directions, from the defense of rights, which would be the closest track to the human rights advocacy in the 1970s, to embracing the ideas of national and ethno-national revival. At the center in Moscow, you see a very clear separation, two key trends in the dissident movement in the 1970s. The one is represented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and the idea is opposition to the communism from the positions of the Russian nationalism and basically Russian imperial sort of nationalism. So Solzhenitsyn is there to bring back the old ideas about pre-1917 ideas of Russia. partial ideas of the wide guard officers and intellectuals. So that the trend that then would make its way into Putin's pronouncements and Putin's beliefs of today. Another trend closely associated, of course, with the Helsinki process is the creation of the Helsinki group and Andrei Sakharov becoming that leader of liberal trend within Russian and within Soviet dissident movement. What you see in Ukraine, it's a different phenomenon. On the one hand, Ukraine produces the largest, in ethnic terms, the largest population of political prisoners in Bloc. Solzhenitsyn writes about that in Archipelago Gulag. Most of them are the participants or supporters of the Ukrainian national and nationalist resistance to the Soviet Union in Western Ukraine. There is an amnesty coming in 1975, but until 1975, most of those people are in prisons, arrested back in the 1950s, in the Gulag system. But once that changes, actually, Ukrainians still produce one of the largest group of now a new wave of the political enemies of the regime, and they are the members of the different sorts of either dissident groups or religious dissidents. The leaders and participants of the Baptist groups that are not registered and those that refuse to be registered. The adherents and the supporters of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that was banned in 1945, 1946. And the participants of the Helsinki group. Ukrainian Helsinki group is being formed, the second one in the Soviet Union after the one that was formed in Moscow. And unlike the Moscow group, it brings together the ideas of the national revival and human rights. Here you see the photos of the one of the leading members of the Helsinki group. At the center is Serhii Plokhii, who starts his career as a good national communist in the late 1950s and early 60s, creates a clandestine organization that wants to make Ukraine independent on the basis of the Soviet constitution that allowed Soviet republics to leave the Soviet Union. Next to him is Vyacheslav Chernovil, a younger person who was a reporter for a communist newspaper who was sent to write reportages on the trials of the Ukrainian dissidents in the 1960s, and kind of a conversion happens, Saul into Paul sort of a conversion. He becomes one of the leaders of Ukrainian Helsinki movement, and one of the brothers Horin, who is here, whose again roots are in Western Ukraine, and there is a more continuation also of this national liberation struggle of the late 40s and 60s there. Who is not on this picture, but were members of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, are also the Jewish activists and human rights advocates. So in Ukrainian Helsinki group, you see representatives of different groups under the common umbrella of the Helsinki Act and ideas of human rights. What that means, and it is extremely important, these people are together creating this Helsinki group, then they are sent to Gulag. They continue their discussions, they continue their communications in Gulag as well. And a new model of Ukrainian nationalism is being born out of the Helsinki movement and out of these communications that are taking place in Gulag. A liberal nationalism, this focus on the rights of the nation, but also this focus on the rights of individuals. So the Ukrainian Jewish cooperation that comes to the fore in once Ukraine becomes independent and in the years leading to independence, this is very much the product of this work of the dissidents and this merge of the ideas of the national liberation with the ideas of human rights as a whole. So that becomes later the foundation of the ideology of Ruch, and puts Ukraine into a different place, puts Ukraine on a different track from what we see in Russia, where the division between the liberals of Sakharov and the nationalists of Solzhenitsyn was never reconciled. Never really a common platform was created that could last for some period of time. But more you see a wave of the Sakharov liberals in the late 1980s, and then the wave of Solzhenitsyn type of nationalists already since Solzhenitsyn's return to Russia in the early 1990s, and then on really until today. So again, these differences between Russia and Ukraine are very obvious today, but their origins are really go all the way back to the 70s and then early 80s, to the Helsinki movement, to the way how it was structured, and to the links, communications, and platforms that was created by those people in Gulag. The person at the center, Levko Lukyanenko, was sentenced to death. Then the sentence was replaced with 15-year imprisonment. He spent 25 years in Gulag, longer probably than any other leader of the human rights movement. And others around him spent at least 15 years, maybe a little bit more. It depends on how you count, whether you count just the Gulag or you count also the settlement under the control, the exile, sort of an exile after that. The political scene in the Soviet Union and in Ukraine starts changing, of course, with the so-called the 5-year period of the Kremlin funerals, Andropov, then of course Chernenko, and by 1985 Gorbachev comes to power. I looked at the literature that I recommended you for this course. There is a number, again, there was a limit of what I could suggest, but two works that really deal with this period, or maybe more than two, directly with this period, that I would like suggest to you. The first one, in terms of the chronology when it was published, it is the Stephen Kotkin's work Armageddon Averted. Was published in the year 2000 to 2001. Another work would be my own, The Last Empire, published in 2015, and the most recent addition to that literature is Vlad Zubov's book Collapse. The works take different I would say approach to the history of the Soviet collapse. With Stephen Kotkin in that book, but also in his book on the uncivil society, the focus is very much on the second-tier political leaders, and the democratic revolutions, both in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as being not so much the rise to the center of the civil society, but as sort of a internal revolution or counter-revolution undertaken by the party elites and managerial elites in the communist states. My look at the fall of the Soviet Union is an attempt to put the Soviet collapse into the broader context of the collapse of the empires in the 20th century, and the Bloc very much focuses on Moscow, and in particular on actions of Gorbachev. And his main argument is that the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't inevitable, so a different kind of a policies introduced by Gorbachev or by some other leader could probably save the Soviet Union, at least at that point, at that time. So again, these are the key interpretative frameworks that have been used to deal with the interpretation of the Soviet collapse. I probably would add also Mark Beissinger's book. Beissinger is a political scientist who looks at the mass mobilization as one of the key factors in leading to the Soviet collapse. So much about historiography. Gorbachev, of course, introduces new thinking on the international arena. We see the formal end of the Cold War coming in 1989, the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Eastern Europe that lead to the, of course, democratic revolutions in that part of the world. One of the reasons for this dramatic changes in the Soviet policy are linked to the fact that Gorbachev and people around him believed that the Soviet Union actually can't continue the arms race without fixing the economy, and the belief was there that the economy could not be fixed without really introducing democratic changes in the society as a whole. So very different track from the one that is taken by the leaders by Deng Xiaoping and the leaders of the Communist Party in China. But let's look at what is happening in Ukraine at that time. Gorbachev turned out to be a very, very skillful apparatchik in the way how he removed the old guard very soon out of power and brought his supporters like Eduard Shevardnadze and Nikolai Ryzhkov and others to power. The longest survivor of the Brezhnev era at the top of the party machine was the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Shcherbetsky, whom you see here, who built probably the most powerful clientele pyramid in the Soviet Union in Ukraine, and was able to hold to power despite the fact that this informal alliance between the Russian elite and Ukrainian elite already ended with Gorbachev coming to power. The lift that was bringing the Ukrainian party cadres and Dnipropetrovsk party cadres to Moscow stopped functioning. The informal alliance between the center and not just the Ukrainian elites, but the regional elites and Republican elites was broken by Gorbachev, who really didn't think much about the fact that the Soviet Union was not yet a Russian nation state, that it was a multi-ethnic post-imperial formation. In 1986, he makes the first huge mistake when it comes to this disregarding the multi-ethnic, multinational composition of the Soviet Union, when he imposes on Kazakhstan an ethnic Russian named Kolbin to replace an ethnic Kazakh loyalist of Brezhnev, whose name was Kunaev, Mohammed Kunaev. He backs off later, Nazarbayev comes to power, but that was just an indication of how blinded Gorbachev was to the fact that he was became the general secretary of the Soviet Union and not just of extended Russian Federation. So starting with mid-1980s, the alliance between the party elite in Kiev and party elite in Moscow falls on very difficult times. The Chernobyl accident in April of 1986 draws another kind of a wedge in relations between official Kiev and official Moscow, as Kiev was really left to be responsible for dealing with the consequences of the accident outside of the plant itself and the site of the nuclear power plant. The policies of the information or lack of information was, of course, something that was Moscow in charge, but dealing with the population and discontent of the population was the responsibility of Kiev. The accident, the episode of the May 1st parade in Kiev, where Sherbitsky didn't want to conduct the parade and Gorbachev insisted on the parade going on, is just one of the many examples of these tensions that were growing between official Kiev and official Moscow. Again, the alliance, the condominium that existed in late 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s stopped existing, which made the Ukrainian party elite to be super loyal to Moscow, actually having second thoughts about what the loyalty was and how much they were prepared to pay for it in terms of relationship with their own people on the ground. And once the period of glasnost starts in Ukraine, and this is 1987, 1988, the first mass mobilizations that are taking place are related to Chernobyl, with the demand, tell us truth about Chernobyl, because the information was highly classified. People didn't know whether their cities or villages where they lived, whether it was affected by the fallout or not. And that affected everybody, from the members of the party, members of the elite, to the average citizens. And the mobilization very early on acquired this characteristics of mobilization of Ukraine and Ukrainian Republic against the center and the communist leaders of Ukraine that were perceived as being the agents of the center. And they found people like Sherbitsky, they found themselves in this very complex and difficult sort of relationship between Moscow officials in Moscow, Gorbachev, with whom they had, for whom they didn't have much of a respect, or to whom they didn't have much of a loyalty, and the mobilization at home. What you see here is this gentleman. His name was Ivan Drach. He died a few years ago. Celebrated poet in Ukraine, who becomes the first leader of Ruch, the popular movement in Ukraine that was really modeled on the popular fronts in the Baltic republics of the Soviet Union. It became a product of the joint efforts between the intellectual elite, Ukrainian intellectual elite, writers, poets, artists on the one hand, and the former dissidents like Levko Lukyanenko, like Chernovil, the figures, the photographs that I just showed to you. The first mass mobilization, the Ruch, comes really out of this mobilization over the issue of Chernobyl. Here you see Drach standing at one of the first mass rallies, very much surrounded by the militia, by the police, the government police, which were in mass present at those rallies, but didn't try to break them out already after 1988, 1989. And one of the reasons for that was that the first rallies, the mass rallies, were allegedly non-political. They were about ecology. They were about Chernobyl and the threat of nuclear energy. But all political parties in Ukraine in the late 1980s had a huge, in their platforms, in their programs, had a big sections dealing with nuclear energy and dealing with ecology. So this is the poster of Ruch, which already brings back the trident, the coat of arms of independent Ukrainian states that existed during the revolution, 1918, 1919, 1920. So there is a bridge being built across the Soviet period to the independent existence of Ukraine, autonomous and independent existence of Ukraine during the revolution. A big shift, a big change in the Soviet Union in general, but in Ukraine in particular, happens with the elections to the Republican Supreme Soviets, or the parliaments in the Soviet republics. Again, major miscalculation on the part of Gorbachev and his advisors, who were still thinking about the Soviet Union as a unitary state. Traditionally, all the decisions were being made in Moscow. And in 1988, Gorbachev conducts this experiment where he is not sure to what degree he can allow free elections to the Supreme Soviet. He creates additional Congress of People's Deputies. The number of deputies are appointed by the party and party-controlled organizations, and others were elected by the popular vote. And he sees that, okay, it's not so bad, the situation that he still can allow certain elements of democracy, but still be in charge. He then allows basically not free, but semi-free elections, much freer than to the central Supreme Soviet, to the Supreme Soviets of the republics. And there, in republic like Lithuania, the supporters of independence of Lithuania win outright. March 1990, the first time that this Republican parliaments meet, during the first session, during the first day, the Lithuanians declare their own independence. In Ukraine, approximately 1/4 of the deputies comes from this national liberal platform, the supporters of the Ruch, which means movement. And they really become, as things progress in 1990, 1991, they become the most organized and the most dynamic force in the Ukrainian parliament, setting the political agenda. Another big development of that period is Gorbachev's decision to legalize, to allow the registration of the parishes of the Greek Catholic Church. I mentioned to you that the church was liquidated by Stalin back in 1946. Its supporters constituted good part of this political prisoners in the Soviet Union in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Probably there were more Greek Catholics in the Gulag when it comes to the political prisoners than representatives of any other religious group or Ukrainians more than other ethnic group. But 1989, there are these changes, dramatic changes are happening on the religious scene in the Soviet Union. And they affect the most, of course, Ukraine. That was part of the Bible Belt of the Soviet Union, was the Bible Belt itself of the Soviet Union, and which had the absolute majority of the Orthodox parishes in the Soviet Union, against something Russian Orthodox, or so-called Russian Orthodox, something that I already discussed discussed before. Now, in 1990 and 91, Ukraine is still, despite this popularity of Ruh, despite mobilization linked to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, linked to the original refusal of the authorities to legalize the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, despite all of that, Ukraine is still very much run by the conservative party elite, who try to preserve a sort of the preserve in Ukraine. Sherbitsky is gone, but people who were close to him, that conservative Brezhnev guard, is still very much in charge of Ukraine and in charge of the government, in charge of the party central committee. Russia emerges at that time as the main vehicle in terms of the democratization when it comes to the not Baltic states, for example, or Georgia or Moldova, but when it comes to the Slavic republics of the Soviet Union. Apart from Russia, of course, it's Ukraine and Belarus. And in the attempt to get as much power for himself and for the Russian Federation, Yeltsin is there to declare the sovereignty of the Russian Federation ahead of Ukraine. Sovereignty, which meant under the circumstances, the preeminence or priority of the Republican laws over the Union laws. And it is, of course, Russian Democrats who are defending democracy in August of 1991, when the Ukrainian leadership, and in particular, future president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, who was at that time the head of the Ukrainian parliament, is trying actually to sit on 2 or maybe even 3 chairs at the same time, not introducing the martial law in Ukraine, but also not mobilizing the population of the republic to a degree that Yeltsin was doing in Moscow, in opposition to that law. The return of Gorbachev says at this point that he was returning to a different country. Indeed, he had no clue how right he was at that point, because he returns to a different country, which is not the old Soviet Union anymore. Yeltsin is a savior of democracy, but he is leader of Russia. The political processes in other republics, Central Asian republics, Baltic states, Ukraine, are already by that time very much defined by the disposition of political forces in each of those republics. In the Baltic states, it's the Popular Fronts that are in the driving seat, and in rest of the republics, or most of the republics, there are the party elites that are still running the show. And Ukraine emerges at that point as a very, very important player on the old Union arena. In August of 24th, the Ukrainian parliament, which was very much communist-dominated parliament, votes overwhelmingly for independence of Ukraine. Officially, the declaration is written not officially, but the Declaration of Independence is written by the veteran of Gulag, Levko Lukyanenko. But it is supported also not just by the former dissidents, it is supported or supporters of Ruh, but also by the former party elite. And is a declaration pro forma, is a declaration of independence from the Soviet Union, but in reality is a proclamation of independence from Russia and from the Boris Yeltsin, who already at that time suspended the activities of the Communist Party on the territory of Russia. the Ukrainian communists are trying to save their control over their republic by declaring independence and supporting that independence. Ukrainian independence is the first independence in the Soviet Union that has been declared by the communist-dominated parliament. And it starts actually an avalanche of the declaration of independence by other republics still controlled by the communist regime, by the communist parties, but by the communist elite, including in Central Asia. This is the moment when again, Yeltsin declares his decision and then signs the decree banning the activities of the Communist Party on the territory of the, not banning but suspending the activities of the Communist Party on the territory of the Russian Federation. This is the image of Leonid Kravchuk, and what happens next is that the Ukrainian parliament on August 24th, when they declare that independence, they're still trying to sit this very traditional for the Ukrainian party elites way on more than one chair. They declare this independence, but they're saying that in December there will be a referendum where the question of the independence will be put for the popular vote by the population. So they still live this way to back off from the independence. But in the fall of 1991, as the disintegration processes in the Soviet Union continue, they decide by October of 1991 to really go all the way for the independence. And they do that because they see that the idea of independence actually acquires traction among the Ukrainian population. The deal of the political elite that they want the independence, but they want an independent country to be run by them, and more specifically by their leader at that time, Leonid Kravchuk, the former long-serving head of the propaganda department in the Ukrainian Central Committee. At the same time that the referendum is taking place in Ukraine on December 1st, 1991, there are also presidential elections. And Kravchuk leads and then wins by landslide. Only the Galician oblasts of Ukraine vote for the former prisoner of Gulag, Vyacheslav Chernovil. What happens next is, of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. 1 week after the Ukrainian referendum and election of Kravchuk as the president of Ukraine, and creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. I will conclude now with the remarks of trying to comment on this quite strange phenomenon for the if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union. Why did the Soviet Union fall in December of 1991, within a few days and weeks after the Ukrainian referendum on December 1st? There is a clear connection between all these things. All of that happens in December. The developments are on the pause, waiting for the results of the Ukrainian referendum, and then it all falls. Ukrainians, when they went to vote in the referendum, the question that they were answering was not whether they wanted the Soviet Union to continue or not. That was the question that was in March of 1991 and referendum conducted in the most, not all, but most of the Soviet republics. The question that Ukrainians were answering in December of 1991 was whether they wanted their republic to be independent, whether they supported the decision of the Ukrainian parliament from August 24th, 1991 to declare independence of Ukraine. More than 92% of those who participated in the elections responded yes to that. There was no other referendum conducted in any other republic on whether those republics want to leave the Soviet Union or not, whether they wanted the continuation of the Soviet Union or not. So Ukrainian referendum was the only one. And Ukrainians, by voting yes, really made a decision on behalf of the majority of the Soviet citizens outside of Ukraine as well, from Russia to Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan and so on and so forth. Yeltsin explained more than once why he believed that the Soviet Union could not continue without Ukraine. He was saying that in the Gorbachev's union, the union that was proposed by Gorbachev, without Ukraine, Russia would be outvoted and outnumbered by the non-Slavic Muslim republics. So that was one explanation. Another argument that is put forward is that, well, Yeltsin was there certainly at that point already trying to save Russia from the economic collapse. And economic considerations were extremely important. To continue running the Soviet Union, that meant subsidizing a majority of the republics with the second largest partner, who happened to be also traditionally Orthodox and traditionally Slavic, was the sort of the arrangement that Yeltsin was not, and people around him were not interested in, but also could not afford economically. So the vote in the second largest republic in Ukraine decided the fate of the Soviet Union in 1991. What was left undecided was really the future of that space. Immediately at meeting in Belovezha or Vyskuli in Belarus, documents were signed for the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. But what that would be, what would come out of the Commonwealth of Independent States, whether a new form of Russian control over the post-Soviet space, or as they were saying in Kiev at that time, an instrument for civilized divorce, that question was unanswered. There were a lot of question marks next to it. That's something that was already developing in the 1990s and then later, and to a degree also decided now on the battlefields of this current war. So I will conclude my presentation here and now. Again, I wasn't able to cover a number of important parts of the story of the Soviet collapse, but I'm open to discuss those issues. Again, please ask your questions, but also if you have questions on the post-1991 developments, if you think that history is at play there as well, I welcome those questions too. Thanks again. And I stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Thank you so much, Professor Plokhii, for the wonderful lecture. I'm going to urge our audience to send in questions on the Q&A function, or if need be through the chat, but preferably through the Q&A function. And while our audience formulates its questions, I have a couple of my own. I'll sort of wait and see when the audience questions come in. I'm going to start with a very broad one that may in some ways be difficult to answer, but it follows from the interesting distinction that you make at the very end of the Soviet period, that you have Kravchuk, as you mentioned, sort of occupying multiple chairs, and sort of widespread democratic sentiment in Russia at the time. That's hard to reconcile with the world that we see before our eyes at the present moment. Sort of that's the question I wish to ask. Sometimes Volodymyr Zelensky is referred to as the first post-Soviet leader of an East Slavic state. Obviously, the comparison would be between him and Lukashenko on the one hand, and Zelensky and Putin on the other. I think that this is a generational point about the sort of the age of Zelensky, but I think it's also, for those who believe that he's the first post-Soviet leader, it's also a question about his sensibility, which is indeed less Soviet than either Putin's or Lukashenko. So I wanted to ask you about this. How could it be that Ukraine would have the first post-Soviet leader, if that's a judgment that you would share, really fundamentally different from both Russia and Belarus? So I wanted to ask about this, and it goes beyond the scope of the material that you've been lecturing on, but it is a question
Sure.
about the Soviet
Well,
legacy.
again, thanks. I think these are important questions that, again, partially they can be explained through history, but not entirely. Well, the most obvious answer to the question of why Ukraine has Zelensky while Russia has Putin or Belarus has Lukashenko is that in Ukraine you have free elections, and new people emerge, and new people have a chance to rise to the top of the political machine, despite the fact that, again, like Zelensky, they have no background in that. So the one reason is that, okay, Ukraine has functioning democracy, and Russia doesn't. And that's something that was probably almost impossible to predict in the year 1990 or 91. As I said, again, you have Yeltsin, this mobilization, especially in the leading cities of Russia, like Moscow and Leningrad at that time, and Sverdlovsk, and so on and so forth. And you have very, very conservative party elite still holding on power in Ukraine. But once the Soviet Union is gone, what you see is that the Ukrainians try to really create functioning democracy in their republic now, like Russians are trying to do that in the Russian Federation. But what works in favor of Ukraine, and here I'm borrowing from writings of Lucan Way, one of the political scientists in Canada who was writing on those subjects, is that because of Ukrainian regionalism, which is part of certainly Ukrainian history, differences between regions in terms of the historical trajectory, in terms of the culture, language that is being used, and so on and so forth, you see a very pluralistic landscape in Ukraine, politically, culturally, religiously, and so on and so forth, which means that there is no chance for any party to establish itself as a dominant force in the parliament. One of the readings that I suggested for this course, an article written by Itzhak Brudny and his co-author, I don't remember the name right here, draws the difference between Russia and Ukraine, pointing on the fact that in Russia they were able to establish very early on a kind of a dominant nationalist narrative, when in Ukraine that narrative was contested. It was not just the narrative contested about the national identity, the politics remained to be contested. And this regionalism was on the one hand, and continues to be, a weakness that was used against Ukraine by Russia back in 2014, 2015. It doesn't work anymore, but it also provided the foundations for a viable Ukrainian democracy, because by definition, there was just impossible for any one force to capture the parliament, to capture the government. There were two attempts to follow the Russian model of strong presidential power, or creating of strong presidential power. Both of them ended with the Maidans in 2004 and then in 2013, 2014. Yeltsin fires at the Russian parliament in 1993 and puts forward a referendum on the constitution with strong presidential powers. In 1993, Ukraine goes through the same sort of a crisis. Kravchuk tries to do exactly the same thing that Yeltsin wants to do. He wants a referendum on the stronger presidential powers. And that referendum never happens because of the protests in Kyiv, because of the protests in Ukraine. The society that is still very active and the mass mobilization that is still very active in Ukraine in 93 stops Ukraine from following the path of Russia. in 93, then in 2004, then in 2013. And again, the regionalism is an important part of that story.
Thank you so much. We have two questions, I'm glad to say, from our audience. I'll get to them in just a moment, but I wanted to ask one further question following from the phrase that you used for the 1970s and 1980s, and had sort of many images to confirm this tendency, a sort of period of elite level Russian-Ukrainian partnership and empire building also through this partnership. And I wanted to hone in on the word elite and asked about the non-elite levels, where I would assume the story is far more complicated and doesn't go in quite the same direction, doesn't go in the same direction entirely. So I'm curious about the sort of non-elite dynamic in the 1970s and 80s when it comes to questions of Russia and Ukraine. Those are not the perfect words for the time, but for the relationship between these sort of two entities.
Yes. Well, what you really see on the level of non-elites is that Ukraine, really the population in terms of their ethnic identity, relation to cultures, and so on and so forth, would be roughly divided in three groups. And one of those groups would be Ukrainian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians, which that group would be dominant in Western and parts of Central Ukraine. Then there would be Russian-speaking Russians, which would be in the Crimea and parts of Donbass and major industrial centers of east and south of Ukraine. And then in the middle is the group of Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians, who are this kind of a connecting tissue between the two other groups. And that group emerges out of the failure of the Ukrainization, linguistic and cultural Ukrainization of the 1920s and 1930s, where the attempts to Ukrainize and maintain the Ukrainian language of the Ukrainian migrants to the cities failed. The cities became a major places of Russification, cultural Russification of those migrants from the Ukrainian cities. But the politics in general actually allowed for the Ukrainian identity, like today's Putin's vision doesn't allow for that, allowed for a separate Ukrainian identity despite the linguistic Ukrainization. And what you see in Ukraine in the 70s and 80s is really rise this maybe proto-civic form of Ukrainian identity, which is not closely connected to the language or culture, which allows multiplicity of languages and cultures, which then in turn allows this elite political alliance between the Ukrainian and Jewish dissidents in the 70s and 80s, right? Because idea of what Ukrainian is actually, it is about loyalty to the place, to the political institutions, and to the, but not necessarily to the language, allows multiplicity of languages and religions. And in 1991, the percentage of ethnic Jews who support Ukrainian independence is higher than percentage of ethnic Russians, despite the fact that in both groups you have way over 50% of support. And you get in the Crimea, where the ethnic Russians are the majority, you have over 60%, I don't remember the figures now, but certainly over 50%, way over 50% voting for Ukrainian independence. And in Sevastopol, even higher percentage than in average over Crimea. Because the Ukrainian identity of 1991 is really associated with sort of a patriotism. So attachment and linked to your city, to your village, to this territory, and quite pluralistic in terms of your attitude toward language.
Well, it seems like there are very interesting ways in which your answer to my first question intersect with your answer to my second question of a proto-civic identity, perhaps helping to explain this transition away from a Soviet style of politics later on. Let me turn now to a question from Joseph Loya, who begins by saying, please and broadly, to what extent did the Ukrainian project cohere or not cohere with or within the Slavophile project?
Sorry, could you please repeat it once again?
Of course, yeah. About the extent to which the Ukrainian project cohered, or where there may have been slippages with surrounding broader Slavophile projects.
Okay. Basically, it's what you understand when you use term Ukraine. During the revolution of 1917 and before that, there was a clear distinction between the supporters of Ukrainian parties and Ukraine, which presupposed exclusive Ukrainian identity, and Little Russians, where the identity was to a degree inclusive in a sense that it allowed participation in a broader Russian or East Slavic project with maintaining language, linguistic and cultural differences and so on and so forth, but politically being part of big Russian nation. By the time of 1991, you see that the term Little Russian is just, was discredited, it is not used anymore. But then the term Ukraine and Ukrainian project is used in a different varieties and versions. So when Solzhenitsyn or Putin speaks about Ukraine and Ukrainian, they really refer to a model, to a Little Russian model. When Solzhenitsyn writes about creation of a one state out of East Slavs, where he doesn't call Ukrainians Little Russians, he calls them Ukrainians, but he sees the big Russian nation, which now would consist out of Russians and Ukrainians. So if the test, the main principle of nationalism is the ethnic borders coincide with the political borders, Solzhenitsyn's state, East Slavic state, suggests that he thinks about one Russian nation, but he uses term Ukraine. And when Putin speaks about Ukrainians, he means Little Russians. He means the inclusion of Ukrainians into the big Russian nation, one way or another. And when he talks about denazification and his propaganda machine, the meaning of denazification is actually really extermination of Ukrainian idea as idea of exclusivist identity, and Ukrainian identity as exclusivist Ukrainian identity. So the short, now trying to summarize what I was saying is that it depends today what you mean when you talk about Ukraine. It's almost would be much easier and simpler to use terminology from 1917 and pre-1917. If you think about Ukraine and Ukrainian identity as exclusivist identity, then it is basically it emerges, it exists, outside and in opposition to the model of big Russian nation or East Slavic project. If you think about Ukraine as just language and culture and basically not a political identity and not exclusivist identity, then certainly it can be part of the broader East Slavic project.
Okay, we have a further question from Suzanne Sadaline. How did the Ukrainian political prisoners forge a marriage between nationalism and human rights? What were the issues, events, or personalities that bound these separatist approaches? Thank you. Thank you from our question.
Well, there was a very interesting dissertation written here at Harvard by Beth Curley, who is now in DC, working in the Endowment for Democracy, about the ideas of human rights in the late Soviet Union. And what she found out that no one knew before that, certainly I didn't know, that was that there is a very interesting evolution of the ideas about the human rights that emerges in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, on the elite level, but also on the dissident level. And by the end of the Soviet Union, during the last years of the Soviet Union, really the dominant focus of the human rights activism, rhetoric, and so on and so forth became not so much the human rights of individuals as rights of nations. Rights as nations that became part of this broader human rights movement. And it is the extension of the idea of the human rights of individual to the extension of the human rights of nations that created a platform, or that platform was created by this alliance between the nationalism and liberalism in Ukraine. And the platform of Ruch, the first movement for independence of Ukraine, it is really a national liberal platform, which puts emphasis on the rights of the nations as multi-ethnic Ukrainian nation, civic nation, at the same time protecting the rights of minorities. Where the Ukrainian project really had a major difficulties and challenge was defining what the minorities were, because in the 1990s and 2000s, what you see is that the implementation of the European or related to European Union norms and laws and legislation related to the defense of the minorities was really not working in Ukraine, because that legislation was used by let's say, the supporters of the Russian Spring of 2014 and 2015, where the Russian language and Russian culture, which was de facto the dominant culture in Ukraine, was presented as a minority culture. And that's where the real clash occurred, because again, that's not the definition of the minorities, ethnic minorities or linguistic or cultural minorities in the European context. And it is only 2014, 2015, and then the current war that really changes the geography, changes the political geography of Ukraine, but also allows for the first time to speak about the carriers of the Russian culture as a minority in Ukraine. So that's again where the Ukrainian liberal nationalism project encountered some difficulties with adjusting to the norms promoted by European Union.
Professor Plokhii, we have one final question, which is a little bit on the technical side, which is fine, of course, but I'll ask the question in just a second if you have any sort of closing comments, given that this is the sort of the last of your 3 lectures. Please feel free to fold them into this final question, but I'll ask it, and then we'll thank you for your time and for all that you've shared, and after that we'll draw this 3-part lecture series to a close. So the question itself is from Suzanne Freeman, who is curious about how you would explain the limited reform of Ukraine's security services inherited from the Soviet Union, such as the SBU and MVD in the 1990s and 2000s. One thinks of famous scandals from the period like the Kuchma tapes when President Kuchma gave illegal orders to MVD officials for the murder of a journalist, and more recent issues related to police brutality in 2014. So it's a technical question, but of course about the Soviet legacy, and that's that's the last question from our side.
Sure. Thank you for this question. Again, what we see is that Ukraine, on the one hand, certainly managed to keep this democratic experiment that was started in the late 1980s and early 1990s alive and going, unlike Russia. But it doesn't mean that actually Ukraine went through the sort of the transformations that the Baltic states, for example, underwent on all levels. And the most obvious reason, again, reasons could be probably numerous, but most obvious reason is that the National Democrats of the late 1980s and early 1990s never managed to really win in the either parliamentary elections or presidential elections. The leaders of Ukraine in the 1990s were still the former party cadres. Again, the head of the propaganda, Kravchuk, who was then replaced by the before that, the head of the party committee of this missile facility in Dnipropetrovsk, and then the director of that facility, the Pivden Mash. The same is true for the parliament. The majority was never in the hands of the sort of reformers that we see in the Baltic states. I would add that this reformist trend was even weaker in Ukraine than it was in Russia during the 1990s, during the times of Yeltsin. So Yeltsin, using his authoritarian or semi-authoritarian powers that he received with this constitution, with strong presidential power, he was trying to introduce those market reforms, and Ukraine was just out of necessity repeating them. So the very conservative party elite didn't disappear anywhere. So it had to adjust, it had to live and exist with the challenge coming from the National Democrats. It couldn't crush them, but it still hold to the power in many ways. And again, you look at the reforms in Russia and Ukraine in the 1990s, and Ukraine is just trailing Russia in many ways. So that would be my explanation, maybe a little bit broader than something that you wanted or expected to hear, but explanation of all this lack of reforms of interior services or security services or anything of that. So in many ways, they remained to be more Soviet in Ukraine than in a number of other republics, including to a degree Russia.
Professor Plokhii, thank you so much for today's lecture and engagement with our audience. Thank you for the three lectures. Altogether, I couldn't think of a better way to begin this year's Monterey Symposium. So we're simply delighted, and we're honored to have you among us for the last three lectures. And I'm quite sure that the themes and the questions that you've defined in your lectures and helped to contextualize with the assigned readings, I'm quite sure that they will reverberate throughout the rest of the symposium and beyond that for the students in this program. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for questions and discussion. It was a pleasure to be part of your symposium and to be part of the seminar, and I certainly wish participants all the best in whatever you have ahead, the lectures or seminars or discussion between yourselves. And I look forward to the event in July.
we only wish that we could have welcomed you to California as we suffer through the heat and the humidity of the East Coast, but perhaps in future years. So once again, thank you so much, and
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
bye-bye.